is it? Oh, isn't it funny how Mondays can still suck even during a pandemic? I know it's Tuesday when you're going to be watching this, or even later for the procrastinators. I guess I shouldn't call out procrastinators when I'm making this video once again, way later than I wanted to, but here we are. Alright, today we are moving on to a different topic. Today we're talking about the women's movement. But before we get into that, you know we're going to talk about some other stuff first. First order of business, you voted, I listened. Without further ado, here is our new attendance bracket topic. This month, we will be crowning the ultimate ice cream flavor. I, for one, am extremely excited, if you can't tell. Second order of business, our daily shout out to all of you who have been getting in your work this past week. You tell it's a heart. Anyway, love you guys. Should I get the bobcat? You can creep in the corner, that's fine. Alright, let's get down to business. Today we are discussing the birth of the women's rights movement in America. This issue was not unique to America, but for centuries women had been discriminated against. Women did not enjoy the same rights as men. And in the early years of the country, women had almost no rights. For instance, women were not allowed to vote. They couldn't own property. Husbands were seen as women's guardians. They controlled their property and their money. So as soon as you got married, it was like you were the property of your husband. Women couldn't be leaders in churches. They couldn't be leaders in the community. Educational opportunities for these women were extremely limited. Like, higher education was not a thing for women back then. The attitude was basically like, you could read, what else do you need to do? If a marriage ended in divorce, husbands almost always were given the children. Now, before the 1800s, some women had already been pushing for more rights, notably like Abigail Adams, but it was during the 1800s that this really started to pick up steam. So we're gonna go over 3 important women and what their contributions were to the birth of this women's movement in America. So you could kind of make the argument that it all started with this lady right here. This woman's name was Lucretia Mott. Now, she was a Quaker. If you guys remember, Quakers were a religious group. They used to be based in Pennsylvania back in the day, and they had always been all about equality, whether that was for race or gender, so we gotta give them some props for that. So since she was a Quaker, she had enjoyed more equality in her community, and she was an abolitionist. So she originally had the idea for a women's rights reform when she was excluded from the World Anti-Slavery Convention. So here's what happened. Like I said, she was an abolitionist. She was all fired up about fighting slavery. She went all the way to England to go to this giant anti-slavery convention. And when she got there, she was told, oh, you can't come in because you're a woman. Well, she was understandably a little bit upset about that, because what did her being a woman have to do with her fighting against slavery? She was fed up and she decided that it was time for a change. Our next reformer is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of my all-time favorites. So she was also at this convention, and she became friends with Lucretia Mott because they commiserated over, what the heck, why are we not allowed to go in here? So they put their heads together and they decided, you know what, we're gonna go back to the States and we're gonna change things. So she was one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention, one of the first women's conventions ever, and we're gonna talk about that in just a second. She was the author of the Declaration of Sentiments, and she became one of the main fighters for women's suffrage. Just so we are clear, suffrage is the right to vote. Suffrage is not suffering. Suffrage is good. We want suffrage. Okay? Our final reformer is Susan B. Anthony, and I'm sure that name sounds familiar to a lot of you guys. Like the others, she was an abolitionist, and then she started to turn more of her attention to women's rights. So she fought for property rights for women, so women could actually own property. She called for co-education so that women had the same educational opportunities that men did. And she was a strong advocate for women's suffrage. So much so that in 1872, Anthony was actually arrested for voting in her hometown of Rochester, New York, and convicted in a widely publicized trial. She knew she would be arrested, she knew it was against the law, but she did it anyway to try to make a point that, hey, women deserve this right. So about this whole Seneca Falls Convention thing, it was organized by Mott and Stanton, and it was the first ever women's convention and advertised itself as a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious conditions and rights of women. It was seen as the beginning of the women's rights movement. While these women were there, and it was attended by men as well, Frederick Douglass was there, women started to kind of lay out all the things they wanted to see changed in America, namely that they would actually be treated like people instead of like second-class citizens. The Seneca Falls Convention is where the Declaration of Sentiments was signed. The Declaration of Sentiments was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, and it was a document that Elizabeth Cady Stanton put together to lay out the rights that women were asking for. Next 2 days, you are going to be studying that document, so be prepared. It was also here that this crazy little idea started, that maybe the way to get change was to have a voice in government, and the way to have a voice in government was by voting. So women realized they needed to start to fight for the right to vote. Despite the Seneca Falls Convention, despite the Declaration of Sentiments, there was still a long road ahead for women. The Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Sentiments, calls for women's suffrage. It was all met with scorn and ridicule from other Americans. According to them, women were too stupid to vote. It wasn't their place. They didn't know anything about government, so what would they even do with that right? A lot of people had no interest in seeing women earn the right to vote, and yet, despite the ridicule, calls for voting did not stop. In fact, over the years, they got more intense. Demonstrations got bigger. Women of all different colors and different backgrounds came together to start to demand the right to vote. They protested in different ways. They would go to the White House. They would have these picket signs. They protested publicly and loudly, demanding their rights. Sometimes they were arrested. A lot of times they were ridiculed. Sometimes women were beaten. They were spit on. And yet, despite all of this, no matter what, no one could ever stamp out the women's movement and their call for the vote. Change never happens until change cannot be stopped, and until the voices crying out for change start to finally overpower the people that are trying to oppress them. It was Western states who first gave women suffrage. Utah was actually the first place that a woman ever legally cast a vote. And soon after Western states started to give women this right, the rest of the country started to wake up as well. By the 1910s, millions were calling for women's suffrage, and it became clear that this was inevitable. In 1920, 70 years after the Seneca Falls Convention and 70 years of struggle finally led to the 19th Amendment being added to the U.S. Constitution, and American women finally had the vote. And the women's movement did not stop there. In the 100 years since American women have had the right to vote, they've also fought countless other battles, including equal pay, equal treatment under the law, better healthcare, better education opportunities, and the fight still continues for true equality to finally be achieved in America. So much so that just a couple years ago, in 2017, one of the largest demonstrations in history occurred, which was the Women's March on Washington, D.C. So to this day, even though gender equality hasn't fully been achieved, I do think it's important that we acknowledge just how far women have come. We've gone from Susan B. Anthony being arrested for voting and being a woman who dared to try to have her voice be heard, to over 100 years later, her grave being covered in I voted stickers, placed there by women. Alright, speaking just to my girls for a second, please never forget that there were women who spent their entire lives fighting to give you the right to vote. These women were humiliated, their families were torn apart, some were even abused and tortured for this, and yet they kept fighting so that girls like you would one day grow up in a country where they had the right to vote. Please don't take that for granted. And in fact, speaking to everybody now, no matter who you are, somebody fought to give you the right to vote. If you want to see things in this country change for the better someday, then the best way to do that is to utilize that right. Okay, thanks for listening. I've changed my mind on what we're doing this week. Today you're taking a short little quiz on this video. It should be pretty easy. And then tomorrow you're going to be breaking down what the Declaration of Sentiments was actually saying. I'm just going to tell you right now, I'm giving you 2 days to do this, okay? You'll probably get it done in 1 day, but don't stress yourself out. You can do half of it tomorrow, half of it Thursday. You're all good. Alright, gremlins, I know I say it every single time, but I do miss you. I hope you guys are all safe and you're all healthy and you're doing well, okay? Bye!